To go in the rain. O'Hare at dawn when the terminal is still half asleep and the tarmac runs silver under the floodlights. Gate B-17, a boarding line forming in the gray. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Kind of morning that happens 10,000 times a day in across this country and leaves no record of itself. A man walks to his seat, navy suit. Silver watch on his left wrist, worn at the edges. He doesn't rush. He sews his bag. He sits. He looks out the window at the rain. Then a woman in a gold-edged name tag walks down the aisle. She looks at him before she reaches the row. She has already decided something behind her. Couple in expensive clothes waits with the patience of people who have never had to wait for anything. The man in the window seat does not move. He simply looks up, and the morning, which was supposed to be ordinary, becomes something else entirely. The rain started before dawn. By the time Marcus Webb reached Gate B-17 at O'Hare, it was coming down hard. Sheets of it. Gray and relentless against the terminal glass. The kind of rain that makes everything feel heavier than it is. Not dangerous, just present. The kind that reminds you the world has its own schedule and does not adjust for yours. Marcus didn't rush. He never rushed through airports anymore. He had learned, somewhere between his 32nd and 40th business trip, that rushing through airports was something you did when you were still trying to prove something. When you still needed people to see you moving fast, looking purposeful, looking like you belonged in the space you occupied. He was 45 years old. He was done proving things. His suit was pressed. His shoes were clean. On his left wrist, loose against the bone, hung a silver watch. Old, scratched at the face. The kind of watch that had no business being on the wrist of a man who flew first class. Understated in a way that required confidence rather than announced it, which was exactly why he never took it off. The boarding came at 6:47 a.m. Pinnacle Airways Flight 826, Chicago to San Francisco. Now stop. The gate agent's voice was flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who had made this announcement 1,000 times and would make it 1,000 more. Marcus picked up his bag, joined the line. He thought about his father on mornings like this. Not always, not every trip. But when the weather turned gray and the world felt like it was pressing in from all sides, Leonard Webb had a way of walking back into the room without being invited, not a haunting. More like a habit of memory that had learned when it was needed. Leonard had worked 31 years at a warehouse on the south side of Chicago, loading dock mostly, sometimes inventory. His hands had been wide and rough, the knuckles permanently dark, the skin cracked at the joints no matter the season. He owned 2 dress shirts, one for church, one for everything else that mattered. Marcus was 10 years old the night Leonard put on the second shirt Ken took to a restaurant in Lincoln Park to celebrate his birthday. A real restaurant. White tablecloths. Candles in little glass cups. The kind of place Leonard had driven past 100 times and never gone inside. The kind of place where you made a reservation 2 weeks ahead and pretended that was normal. They were seated immediately in the back, next to the kitchen. Next to the service door that swung open every 90 seconds and released a blast of hot air and the clatter of commercial pans. 2 tables away from where the busboys stacked the full trash bins before carrying them out to the alley. The worst table in the room. Given without apology, Leonard said nothing. He opened his menu. He asked Marcus what he wanted. He smiled when Marcus said steak, even though Marcus could see, even at 10, that his father was doing math quietly in his head. Calculating, adjusting. Deciding it was still worth it, they ate. Leonard tipped 20%. More than he could afford. On the drive home, Marcus asked why they didn't say something. About the table, about the location, about the fact that 3 other parties had arrived after them and been seated in the main room with the candles and the tablecloths and the absence of commercial noise. Leonard was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. The kind that meant he was choosing words rather than avoiding them. Then he said, "You won't have to swallow the things I swallowed, not a promise, a decision." Marcus carried that sentence for 35 years. Not because it was angry, because it wasn't. Because Leonard Webb said it the way a man says something he has already made peace with. The kind of peace that costs everything and looks like nothing from the outside. The kind that only people who have paid the full price can recognize in each other. He never cried about that table. That was the part that stayed with Marcus longest. He should have. He had earned it. But he didn't. And Marcus understood later that Leonard had saved the crying for private. had given his son the version that moved forward rather than the version that looked back. The line moved. Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge. The rain was audible even here, tapping against the metal overhead. He walked through it toward the aircraft door. He was thinking about what his father had saved so Marcus wouldn't have to swallow. And he was thinking, without bitterness, about how long it took the world to get the message. Some mornings it still hadn't. First class was half empty when Marcus boarded. That was the thing about early morning flights. The people who could afford the front of the plane could also afford to show up late. So the cabin had that particular stillness of a room that knows it's about to fill but hasn't yet. Overhead bins still open, flight attendants moving quietly between the galley and the aisle, the soft mechanical hum of systems being checked and rechecked before the world woke up and needed somewhere to be. Seat 3A window, left side, his preferred position on westbound flights. You could watch the sun rise behind you and never have to chase it. He had figured that out on his 43rd trip and had booked 3A on westbound routes ever since. He stowed his bag in the overhead bin, settled into the seat, unfolded the leather slightly, and let the seat adjust to the angle he used on long flights, the one that left his lower back without complaint. He put his phone on silent but kept the screen facing up. There was a message from Vivian Cole, his assistant of 12 years, sent at 6:30, confirmed Stanson's team at Pinnacle headquarters tomorrow, 9 a.m. All prep materials sent to the board, safe flight. He set the phone face down on the armrest outside the oval window. Rain moved across the tarmac in long, sweeping lines. Ground crews in yellow jackets moved between aircraft, their heads down against the weather. A cart loaded with luggage rolled past and wobbled on the wet pavement. Someone's suitcase shifted on the top of the stack, and the worker caught it without looking up. Muscle memory. Years of it, Marcus closed eyes for 1 minute, not sleeping, not meditating, just being still in a way that the world rarely permitted, taking inventory of the day ahead. The meeting, the contract. 3 years of work compressed into a 2-hour presentation that would either change the trajectory of Pinnacle Airways or end the conversations. Trident Civic Systems had built something the airline industry hadn't seen. A customer service platform that didn't just track complaints. It analyzed patterns. It identified the invisible architecture of how people were treated differently based on data points the companies themselves would never openly admit to collecting. Routing times, response speeds, the language used in written communications. Upgrade allocations broken down by traveler profile over time. It revealed things that made executives very uncomfortable, which was, of course, exactly the point. The airlines needed it because the lawsuits were getting expensive, and the public scrutiny was getting worse. And the gap between the experience they advertised and the experience certain passengers reliably received had become too visible to ignore. They needed Marcus because he was the only one who had built it. He opened his eyes. One more breath. Then voices from the jet bridge. The sound of boarding beginning in earnest. She came from the forward galley, Diana Thorne, senior flight attendant. Her name tag was gold-edged, which Marcus had learned meant premium cabin designation. She was in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back with precision, Pinnacle uniform pressed without a wrinkle. She moved through the aisle with the ease of someone who had done this long enough to make authority look effortless. She was looking at him before she reached the row. That was the first thing Marcus noticed, not her approach, her gaze. The way her eyes had already formed a conclusion before her mouth opened. The way the conclusion was already settled somewhere behind her expression. Waiting for the words to catch up, sir. Her voice was professionally warm, calibrated. Just enough warmth to sound reasonable. I need to speak with you about this seat. Marcus looked up from the wind. Okay, he said. He did not move. He did not straighten in his seat or shift toward her or perform the small physical adjustments that people made when they anticipated being deferential. He simply looked at her and waited. Deanna's chin lifted slightly. A micro-adjustment. The posture of someone preparing to say something they have rehearsed enough times to stop examining it. This row is part of a standing accommodation for some of our long-term premium members. The Hargroves, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove, they fly this route regularly. This section is their usual arrangement, she said it the way someone recites rather than explains. Smooth but without substance. The words in the right order but emptied of the logic that would make them coherent. I have an assigned seat, Marcus said. Of course. The smile held. But given the circumstances, I'd be happy to show you my boarding pass. He reached into his jacket. Deanna put one hand up. Small, almost casual. Like the paper itself was beside the point. Like the paper had already been disqualified from relevance before it was produced. That won't be necessary, 4 words. Marcus had been alive for 45 years, and he had developed over the course of them a very precise instrument for detecting that particular frequency. That won't be necessary. I have already decided, which meant your documentation does not interest me, which meant we both understand what this is actually about, and we have both agreed, without agreeing, to pretend otherwise. He let his hand return to the armrest. He did not give her what she needed. He did not stand. He did not lean forward with that apologetic arrangement of features that people in his position had been conditioned to produce in exactly these moments. The slight furrow, the cooperative tilt of the head, the expression that said, I understand this is awkward for everyone. Let me make it less awkward by making myself smaller. No, he sat, completely still, like a man who had paid for the seat, because he had, then they appeared. Richard Hargrove was 59 years old and built like someone who had been told his whole life that he was substantial, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that had been cut by someone who understood that the difference between expensive and very expensive lived in the shoulders. He moved through the aisle the way certain men move through spaces they considered theirs by right. Not aggressive, settled, already certain of how this ended. Beside him, Constance Hargrove, cream blazer, pearl earrings that caught the overhead light when she moved. A leather bag she carried with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because holding it gave her a kind of composed authority that her posture alone almost achieved. Her smile was that had been practiced so long it no longer required effort. It existed on her face the way furniture existed in a room, placed, permanent, faintly decorative. Deanna turned to them, and her face changed, not dramatically, not in a way she would notice or that anyone could point to cleanly, but the degree of warmth increased, the softness in the voice increased. The deference was subtle and thorough and completely audible to anyone paying attention. I understand, Mr. Hargrove. We'll take care of this, Richard nodded once. The nod of a man who had been told things would be taken care of so many times that being told had become indistinguishable from it being true. Constance glanced at Marcus. Surely there's been a mix-up, she said. Her voice was light, almost pleasant, the kind of a voice that had learned to carry damage without sounding like it intended to. These systems get confused sometimes. She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. These systems get confused. Marcus understood exactly what she meant. Not the booking software, not the reservation. People like him created the confusion. They appeared in places where the expected arrangement did not include them. They disrupted the geometry of a world that had organized around a different set of assumptions. Mark kept his face even. Not because he felt nothing. He felt everything with full clarity. But he had learned, across decades of exactly this kind of moment, that anger was the one gift they wanted from him most. Anger would reorganize the story. Anger would make him the disruption. Anger would let Diana Thorne exhale and call it justified. He would not give them that. There's no mix-up, Marcus said, quietly. This is my assigned seat. Richard made a sound, half laugh, half to hassle. Look, he said, we've been flying this airline for 15 years. We always sit in this row. The airline knows that. Marcus looked at him. Knowing isn't the same as assigning. He said silence, just a second of it. The kind that happens when something true lands in a room that had not prepared for it. In row 2, a woman named Ruth Calloway had stopped pretending to read. She was 72, retired. She had spent 34 years teaching high school's history in Columbus, Ohio. She had taught the civil rights movement every single year. Every year, she had shown her students photographs of the lunch counter sit-ins. She had read them testimony from Montgomery. She had asked 16-year-olds to consider what it cost a person to remain seated in a place they had every right to be while the world demanded that they stand. She knew this scene. She had described this scene to teenagers in a classroom with fluorescent lights and a whiteboard and the low-grade restlessness of adolescents who hadn't yet understood that history had a texture, that itself smelled like something, that it happened at the speed of a regular conversation, And now she was sitting 3 feet from one, and her hands were in her lap, and she had not said a word. "Say something, Ruth." She didn't. Not yet. Her coffee cup was still warm. She looked at it, looked back at the scene unfolding at row 3, looked at the coffee again as if it might offer counsel. It didn't. In row 4, Colby Reeves was 26 years old and had been in the process putting his earbuds in when Diana Thorne first approached Marcus. He had one bud in, one dangling, and had frozen exactly that position. He worked as a community college counselor in Sacramento. He spent his days with students who apologized before asking questions. Students who said sorry to bother you when they needed help that was literally his job to provide. Students who had absorbed, somewhere in the space between childhood and adulthood, the belief that their needs were fundamentally inconvenient to the people responsible for meeting them. He recognized what was happening in seat 3A. He recognized the shape of it, the way Yo recognized a song from the first 2 notes. Before the melody fully arrives, before you can name it, you just know. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, raised it, not all the way, just enough. The lens angled quarter-fluid, row 3. His hands were not entirely steady. He raised them anyway, because the only thing worse than being uncertain about the right thing to do was being certain about it later, when it was too late. Diana returned to row 3 with a different register in her voice. The warmth was still technically present, but underneath it, something had shifted. Something with a harder edge. "Sir, I need you to gather your belongings and move to another available seat." "That's not going to happen," Marcus said. "Sir, my name is on the boarding pass for this seat." He said it without edge, without volume, without any of the performance that people sometimes confused with seriousness. Just the plain statement, clean and unambiguous. "I boarded it at the correct time. I sat in an assigned seat. I have shown no disruptive behavior. On what basis you asking me to move?" Diana opened her mouth, closed it. The basis was standing in the aisle behind her in a charcoal suit, waiting with the patient certainty of someone who had never needed to be loud. She couldn't say that. She understood she couldn't say that. So she reached for the version that lived between accuracy and truth. "We are trying to accommodate our most valued customers and avoid a delay." "Valued," Marcus said. Just the word. Diana stopped. "Your most valued customers," Marcus said. "Does that designation depend on who they are or what they paid?" The question went nowhere safe. There was no comfortable answer. Either answer collapsed up the justifications she was standing on. Richard stepped into the silence. "This is absurd." The pleasantry had left his voice completely. "Do you have any idea how we spend with this airline?" Marcus turned his head, slowly, the kind of slow that carries meaning by itself. "No," he said, "and you don't know anything about me." Richard's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to that sentence, not in that order. He was accustomed to the world arranging itself around his presence, not pushing back against it. He was accustomed to, of course, and right away, and the particular species of accommodation that money purchased when you spent it in the same places consistently enough. "You don't know anything about me." It landed hard. Not because it was loud, because it was precise. Constance's fingers tightened on her leather bag until the stitching pressed wide against the leather. And then Ruth Calloway, in row 2, set down her coffee cup. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Vernon turned. "Ma'am, please allow us to handle this." Ruth looked at him over the top of her glasses with the expression of a woman who had spent 34 years not being dismissed by people who underestimated her. "I'm watching you handle it," she said. Vernon Holt had been a cabin services manager for 9 years. He was 48, square jaw, close-cropped brown hair going gray at the temples. He carries himself with posture someone who had decided somewhere along the way that order was not merely preferable but morally necessary. He had managed hundreds of in-flight situations. He knew how to read a cabin quickly, how to categorize a problem and apply the appropriate response. He had come down the aisle from the forward galley because Diana had flagged him with 4 words at the galley entrance. Row 3, need seat support. Vernon walked towards the scene and read it in one pass. A black man in a navy suit, seated calmly in 3A, hands resting on the armrests, the Hargroves standing in the aisle, waiting with the particular offense of people for whom waiting was not a regular condition. A phone recording from row 4. Diana Thorne with the expression of someone who had started something and needed help ending it. Vernon did not stop to ask what had happened. That was his first mistake. He would understand it as a mistake later. But in the moment, he moved straight to assessment based on what he saw rather than what he knew. And what he saw arranged itself into a story he recognized without examining whether the story was accurate. But he stopped beside seat 3A. He put on his professional face, the one that said, "I represent the institution, and the institution has reached a position, Mr." He glanced at Diana. She gave him the name quietly, Mr. Webb. "I'm Vernon Holt, cabin services manager. I understand we're having a situation here." Marcus looked up. "There's no situation with my ticket," Marcus said. Vernon's smile was practiced and thin. "That isn't what I asked." The air changed. Even Richard went quiet. Vernon leaned slightly forward. The classical claim of authority in a confined space. "My crew has made a reasonable request. I need you to cooperate so we can resolve this seating matter and depart on time." Marcus placed both hands flat on the armrests. His posture didn't change. His breathing didn't change. But the stillness around him deepened in a way that made the cabin feel smaller than it was. "Your crew," Marcus said, "is asking me to vacate a confirmed first-class seat. Not for a safety issue. Not for an equipment problem. Not for a medical emergency. A pause, clean and deliberate, for another passenger's preference. Is that correct?" Vernon blinked. Once Stiana shifted behind him, Richard looked at the window. The question was too specific. It closed every comfortable exit. Either Vernon confirmed it and named exactly what was happening, or he denied it and lied in front of witnesses and a recording phone. "We are offering a reasonable accommodation." "To whom?" Marcus asked. Silence. The answer was wearing a charcoal suit and standing in the aisle behind the woman who was supposed to be managing this. Vernon's jaw tightened. He moved to the approach that had ended situations quickly before. The one that didn't require logic, only authority, sir. Refusing a crew member's direction can become a very serious matter. There it was, not security, not yet, but pointing toward it. Close enough that everyone in the cabin understood the trajectory. Marcus held Vernon's gaze without blinking. "I am not refusing a safety direction," he said. "I am refusing to be moved from a seat I paid for, because Mr. Hargrove prefers the window." Richard Hargrove, who had not raised his voice when said 3 words. Just move the man, not ask him to move, not explain the policy to him. Move him. The verb applied to furniture, to an obstacle, to something that occupied space without having a claim to it. The cabin went cold, and from row 2, Ruth Calloway spoke again. "He hasn't done anything wrong." She said it directly to Vernon this time. Not reactive. Deliberate. The difference between someone responding to a situation and someone taking a position on it. Vernon said, "Ma'am, please stay out of this," Ruth said. "I'm already in it." Nobody moved for a moment. The engines hummed. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere near the forward galley, a cart rattled once and went still. Marcus felt the old ache rise in his chest. Not surprise. He was long past surprise. But the ache was different from anger. Older, quieter. The kind that had accumulated across a lifetime of these moments and never quite dissolved because it wasn't supposed to dissolve. It was supposed to be held. Carried as information rather than released as reaction. Hotel lobbies where the valet looked through him. Conference rooms where the handshakes happened before anyone knew what he had built. Elevators where hands moved to bags. Each one small enough to deny. Collectively, they were a weather system. You didn't fight weather. You noted it. You dressed accordingly. He thought about himself at 25. First real job interview. A financial technology firm in downtown Chicago. He had worn the one good suit he owned and shined his shoes the night before and arrived 12 minutes early and signed in at the reception desk with his name printed clearly on the form. He sat in the waiting room for 3 hours and 11 minutes. He had counted. 7 other candidates came in after him. 6 were called before him. When he was finally shown into the conference room, the interviewer, a man in his 40s with the easy confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere, looked up from the resume and said, "Oh, I thought." He stopped himself. "I thought." He never finished the sentence. He didn't need to. Marcus knew exactly what came after "I thought." So did everyone else in that room. The sentence was complete in the stopping of it. Marcus answered every question, precisely, completely, better than he needed to. He didn't get the job, but he didn't leave early. He stayed until the conversation was fully finished. He shook the man's hand on the way out and said it was a pleasure to meet him. Not as a performance, not as capitulation, because his father has something that took years to fully understand. You didn't stay to perform dignity for other people. You stayed because it was yours. And nobody got to make you leave with it. Vern tried once more, Mr. Webb. His voice had dropped to a lower register, still firm, but with something underneath it now. Something that had moved from professional to personal. I want to give you the opportunity to resolve this cooperatively before I have to involve airport security. The word landed in the cabin like a change in pressure. Security. Constance exhaled softly. Richard's face settled into an expression of satisfied inevitability. Like a man watching a machine he trusted finally engaged the right gear, Deanna looked at the floor. Marcus heard all of it. The word, and the relief under the word, and the way authority borrowed from one context got deployed in another. As if the existence of system designed to protect people from genuine threats could be requisitioned to resolve a preference dispute. He did not react, not outwardly. Inside, something moved through him, not fear, something that sat deeper than fear. The recognition of a pattern so old in American life that its rhythm was almost predictable. A black man in spaces where he was unexpected. Resistance to his presence dressed in the language of policy. The suggestion of official force not because anything dangerous had occurred, but because the word itself was enough. Because the word alone changed the geometry of the moment. His father had warned him about this specifically, not in abstractions. Leonard Webb didn't traffic in abstractions. He used specifics. There will be rooms, Leonard had told him, where you are the most prepared person and the last one they want to hear from. You stay in those rooms anyway. You speak anyway. You make them put it in writing. Make them put it in writing. Marcus reached into his jacket. He removed a slim black card holder, leather, worn slightly at one corner, the way things get worn when they're used rather than displayed. He placed it on the armrest. He did not open it. He simply looked at Vernon Holt. Before this becomes anything further, Marcus said, I'd like to ask you a question. Vernon waited. How many passengers have you approached on this aircraft today? Vernon frowned. I don't. You walked down this aisle and stopped at my row, Marcus said. You had already decided something before I said a single word. I'd like to know what you saw when you made that decision. The cabin was completely still. No one answered. The rain against the windows. The hum of the engines beneath the floor. And Marcus Webb in seat 3A asking a question that everyone present could hear and that only one person in the cabin was being asked to answer. Richard shifted his weight. Constance looked at the window. Vernon's ears went red. Not anger, something else. The specific flush of a person who has been asked to say out loud the thing they had done without examining it. And from row 4, Colby Reeves realized that his hand had stopped shaking. He didn't know exactly when it had happened. Maybe when Marcus said you don't know anything about me and Richard's face shows exactly how true that was. Maybe when Ruth Calloway said 4 words into the silence and refused to take them back. Maybe when he understood that what he was watching was not an argument between people with competing claims. It was one man sitting still in a seat he had paid for, while the people around him tried to find a language for making him leave that didn't as exactly like what it was. He worked with students who shrank. That was how he thought of it. Students who made themselves smaller in hallways and offices and classrooms, who prefaced every sentence with, I know this is probably a stupid question, who asked permission to exist in spaces that had been built for them, who had absorbed the belief that their presence was contingent on someone else's comfort. He had spent 2 years trying to explain that it wasn't true. Now here was a man demonstrating it with his entire body. Not loudly, not dramatically, just by remaining exactly where he was. His phone stayed up. Steady, he breathed through his nose and kept the lens level and thought, they need to see this. Call your supervisor, Marcus said. Vernon blinked. Excuse me, your supervisor. Marcus held the card holder, still closed. Call them now. Before this goes further in any direction, Diana looked at Vernon. Vernon looked at Marcus. I am the senior cabin authority on this. Then escalate to whoever is above you, Marcus said. His voice hadn't changed. Same register, same pace, same complete absence of performance that was somehow louder than performance. I'd prefer this be reviewed by someone who hasn't already reached a conclusion. It was not out of request with teeth in it. It was simply precise. And that precision, that refusal to raise the volume, that steady insistence on review and process and documentation, was more unsettling to Vernon Holt than anything else could have been. He had managed angry passengers. He knew the choreography of visible distress. He knew where to stand and what to say, and how to contain something that had a clear shape. This had no shape he recognized. This was a man who had made peace with the possibility that the system would fail him and had decided to document it anyway. Vernon pressed his earpiece, turned toward the galley, and the whole first-class cabin held its breath. Ruth Calloway's hands were still in her lap, but her back was straight now in a way it hadn't been 20 minutes ago. Colby Reeves hadn't lowered his phone. Richard Hargrove checked his watch, the gold one, the one that cost more than most people made in a month, for the third time in 2 minutes. As if the time itself were the problem, and knowing it more precisely would help, Constance was very still. Something had shifted behind her eyes. Not guilt, not quite, but something that might become guilt later, in a quieter place when there was room for it. Deanna stood near the galley entrance, with an expression Margaret recognized from a long career of reading rooms. Not the confidence that had been there when she first walked down the aisle. Something different. The first hairline fracture in a surface that had not been tested in a long time. And Marcus sat in seat 3A, his hands on the armrests, his eyes forward, the silver watch loose on his left wrist, a small scratch on its face from the corner of his father's workbench, where Leonard had knocked it once, and looked at the damage and laughed and said it still keeps perfect time. Marcus could feel every second of it now. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. It was still coming down across the terminal glass, across the tarmac, across the gray Chicago morning that neither waited for anyone nor apologized for the weather it brought. He had spent his life building something in exactly this kind of weather. He could wait a little longer. The forward galley curtain moved. Vernon Holt stepped back through it. Behind him, someone new. Captain Diane Prescott had been in aviation for 26 years. She was 52, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had learned to carry difficult information without broadcasting it. She didn't walk quickly or slowly. She walked with the economy of a person who understood that in confined spaces, every movement said something, and she intended to say only what she meant. She came to row 3. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the boarding pass he had offered and been refused. She looked at Vernon. "What is the seating's assignment on 3A?" she said. Vernon said, "Webb. Marcus Webb." "And who is Marcus Webb?" Vernon said nothing. Marcus opened the slim black card holder for the first time. He placed the card on the tray table, face up under the cabin light. Marcus Webb, founder and chief executive officer, Trident Civic Systems. Captain Prescott looked at it. Something moved behind her eyes. Not panic, not calculation. Something cleaner than either. The expression of a person who has watched a system she is responsible for fail in real time. Not in a report filed 2 weeks after the fact. Not in a post-incident review. Here, in seat 3A, with phones raised and witnesses present and a man who had been sitting perfectly still for 22 minutes while her crew decided what kind of airline they were going to be. She looked at Marcus. "Mr. Webb," she said. "I'm Captain Diane Prescott. I'd like to hear what happened." Marcus looked at her. He assessed her the way he assessed every new person in authority, quickly, without hostility. He had learned across 45 years that authority came in different temperatures. Some cold, some warm only on the surface, some genuinely trying to do the right thing when given the information they needed. He thought Diane Prescott might be the third kind. He wasn't certain yet, but he gave her the courtesy of the assumption. "I know," he said quietly, "but I'd prefer it on record." She held his gaze. Then she nodded once, not the nod of someone ending something, the nod of someone who understood that what was just beginning would take longer than a conversation. "Then let's get it on record," she said. The rain kept falling. The boarding lights were still on. And in seat 3A, the man they had decided did not belong remained exactly where he was. The still unhurried, but watching the truth begin its slow, deliberate walk toward the front of the cabin. Captain Prescott did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at Vernon Holt with the particular stillness of someone who had flown through hot storms over the Rockies and engine warnings above Nevada, and understood at a cellular level that panic was a luxury and volume solved nothing. She had made decisions in actual emergencies. Gear warnings at altitude. A medical event over Kansas that required diverting to Wichita at 2 in the morning with a cabin full of frightened passengers. She knew what a real problem felt like. This was a different kind of problem, not less serious. Different, Vernon, she said. A step back, please. Just that, Vernon, step back. Which, if you've been not watching the last 22 minutes, was the most significant thing that had happened so far. Not the words, the compliance, Vernon Holt, who had walked down the aisle with the posture of institutional finality, stepped back at 2 words from Diane Prescott, and the authority redistributed itself in the cabin as cleanly as a change in air pressure. Captain Prescott turned to Marcus, Mr. Webb. Walk me through what happened. In your own time, Marcus looked at her. He had done this assessment, the rapid reading of a new person in authority, more times than he could count, across boardrooms, across negotiations, across every room that had ever made him justify his presence before asking his name. He had learned to read quickly and without the luxury of being wrong. Diane Prescott was paying attention in a way that was different from the attention Diana and Vernon had paid. They had looked at him and seen a category. She was looking at him and listening for specifics. He gave her specifics. I boarded during the correct window, he said. I sat in my assigned seat. The flight attendant approached me before reviewing my boarding pass. She asked me to move to accommodate another passenger's preference. I declined. The cabin services manager was called. He indicated that refusing a crew direction could become a security matter. The Captain Prescott did not look at Vernon when Marcus said that last part. She didn't have to. The way her jaw adjusted was sufficient, and at no point, Marcus said, did anyone ask to see my ticket before making that request? Silence. Is that accurate, Miss Thorne? Captain Prescott asked. Diana stood very still near the galley entrance. Her scarf was still precisely tied, her uniform still immaculate, 16 years of looking exactly right. But something had left her face. The quiet certainty that had been there when she walked down the aisle to row 3. That certainty was gone now, and what remained looked provisional, unsettled, like structure that had lost one load-bearing wall, eyewise acting on information from the Hargroves. That isn't what I asked, Captain Prescott said. Deanna's lips pressed together for a moment. No, she said. I did not review his boarding pass before asking him to relocate. The sentence dropped into the cabin and did not bounce. It stayed heavy and specific and impossible to soften now that it had been said out loud in front of witnesses. Richards chose the moment to re-enter the conversation. Which was a mistake, Captain, with respect. He moved forward into the aisle, the full performance of a man who expected the room to reorganize around his interruption. Hand gestures. The slight forward lean of someone who believed his presence was itself an argument. My wife and I have been Pinnacle Premium members for 11 years. This arrangement has always been honored. I don't see why 1 passengers, Mr. Hargrove. Captain Prescott didn't raise her voice. She didn't lower it either. She simply stopped him with the flat steadiness of someone who had learned that the most effective form of authority was indifference to being challenged. What seat numbers are printed on your boarding passes? Richard stopped. That isn't. It's the only relevant question right now. A pause. Then Constance said it from her seat. Quietly, almost under her breath. The voice of someone who had made a small, private decision, 3C and 3D. Richard turned to look at his wife. The look was not grateful, but Constance didn't require his gratitude. She had been watching Marcus Webb sit in seat 3A for 25 minutes. She had heard her own husband say, just move the man, in the flat tone of someone describing the relocation of an inconvenient object. And something in the architecture of who she had always assumed herself to be had shifted, not dramatically. A centimeter, but a centimeter was not nothing. Then please take your seat, Captain Prescott said. 3C and 3D. Richard stared at her. He was waiting for the world to correct itself, for the usual adjustment to occur. For someone to recognize the weight of his history with this airline and the size of his expenditure and the reasonable expectations that had governed his travel for 11 years. The world did not correct itself. This is unacceptable, he said. What happened here, Captain Prescott said, is unacceptable. Please sit down, Mr. Hargrove. He sat hard. The way a man sits when sitting is the only power remaining, and he wants the act of it to communicate what his words can no longer accomplish. The buckle of his seatbelt hit the armrest with a sharp metallic sound that rang through the cabin, something listened, not loudly, not visibly, but Ruth Calloway felt it in her chest. The collective physiological exhale of 17 people who had been holding themselves at a sustained tension for the past half hour. Like a rope that had been pulled taut, fiendly given a half-inch of slack. Not enough, but something. Diana was still standing near the galley entrance when Dinetra Rawlings appeared at the aircraft door, the gate agent assigned to Flight 826. 30-something, with sharp, dark eyes that carried equal measures of alertness and exhaustion, her headset sitting sleekly crooked over one ear. She had come because the departure hold had been open for 19 minutes, and operations wanted to know why a gate that should have pushed back 10 minutes ago was still connected to the terminal. She stepped through the door and took in the cabin in one sweep, Marcus Webb in seat 3A, a business card visible on the tray table. Multiple phones raised, Richard Hargrove now seated in 3C, radiating the contained fury of a man accustomed to winning who has just been told the game has different rules than he assumed. Deanna Thorne standing near the galley with an expression that had no comfortable country left to stand in. Vernon Holt near the forward bulkhead, looking at the floor. Dinetra said, "What kind of seating issue?" And before Vernon could compose a version, before Diana could begin the careful construction of a narrative that moved the edges of the story, Marcus said, a confirmed first-class passenger was asked to vacate his assigned seat to accommodate another passenger's preference. No safety concern, no equipment issue. The request was made before his boarding pass was reviewed. Dinetra looked at him, then at the card on the tray table. She read the name, the title. She processed what she was reading, with the speed of someone who had attended the same internal briefings as every other Pinnacle employee in the Premium Services division over the past 4 months. She touched her headset. "Operations," she said, her voice dropping but not enough for the cabin to be excluded. "Can you confirm executive travel notes for passenger Marcus Webb on Flight 826? Diana's eyes closed briefly at the word executive. Half a second. The involuntary response of someone who has understood, 6 too late, the precise category of mistake they are standing inside. Dinetra listened, her posture straightened, shoulders level, chin up. "Yes," she said. "I'm in the first-class cabin now. Passenger is still on board." Seated, a pause. "Noble security has not been contacted." Vernon looked at the aisle carpet when she said that last part. Dinetra continued. "Captain Prescott is present. Yes, I'll stay on." She lowered the headset from her ear, but kept one hand near it. She looked at Captain Prescott. "Corporate operations is requesting a hold on departure, pending incident documentation. They want passenger statements collected before pushback." Diana's hands, which had been clasped in front of her, separated and fell to her sides. The word incident had now been applied. Officially. On record. In the operational language of the airline, incident was not a soft word. It was a category with procedures attached to it, with documentation requirements and review timelines and reporting chains that went upward rather than sideways. Everything that had happened in this cabin in the past 30 minutes was no longer a seating disagreement that could be absorbed into the normal friction of a morning flight. It was a documented incident. With her name in the middle of it, Marcus picked up his phone. He pressed a contact. The name on the screen read Vivian Cole. She answered before the second ring. Marcus, not a question, not a greeting exactly. 12 years of working together had given Vivian Cole a precise instrument for reading the quality of his silences. So what she heard in the single syllable of his name told her everything she needed to orient. "I need you to notify the board chair," he said. "Pinnacle Airways, Flight 826, first-class cabin." "I'm still at the gate in Chicago," category, Vivian said. Efficient, no wasted motion. He looked at Diana Thorne. He looked at Vernon Holt. He looked at Richard Hargrove, who was studying the tarmac through the oval window with the concentrated focus of a man trying to be somewhere he wasn't. "Discriminatory service escalation," Marcus said. "Potential contract review. Preserve everything from your end." Timestamp the notification. 4 words from that sentence moved through the cabin like a pressure change. "Potential contract review. Board chair first," Vivian said. "Then legal? In that order. Done. Are you all right?" "Yes," Marcus said. "I'm in my seat." He ended the call, placed the phone face down, looked up, and found that every person in first class was looking at him directly. Not the careful peripheral surveillance of people performing non-involvement. Direct. Open. The look of people who had stopped pretending they were somewhere else. Something had shifted in the room while he made the call. Not in his favor, exactly. That wasn't the right frame. The room had simply become honest, which was different from favorable. Honesty sometimes made things harder before it made them better. But it was the only material you could actually build with. Vernon Holt stood near the forward bulkhead and did the math. It took him approximately 15 seconds. He had been peripherally aware that Pinnacle was in technology negotiations with an outside firm. He had attended one briefing on it 4 months ago, a Tuesday morning in the operations conference room on Concourse F, and had left early because there was a gate conflict on Concourse H that needed physical presence to resolve. He had not read the follow-up materials. He had marked the email read and filed it under corporate initiatives, the folder where things went that were important to someone else's department. He knew now. He knew because he had watched Diana Thorne's face when Marcus said the name on his card. He had watched the color shift in her skin. He had watched her hand tighten on the tablet she was holding until her knuckles changed. He had watched her do the arithmetic and arrive at the number and understand what the number meant for the morning she had just spent in this cabin. Trident Civic Systems, Marcus Webb, the contract that Howard Stanton's team had been pursuing for 8 months. The contract that appeared in every all-hands meeting as a strategic priority. The contract that had its own slide in the executive presentation, with color-coded timelines and projected implementation dates, and a headline that said Transformational Partnership in a typeface that communicated seriousness. The man they had tried to remove from his seat was holding the contract. Vernon's hands were not shaking, but something inside them was, some internal tremor that hadn't reached the surface yet but was looking for a way out. He thought about the word he had used, security. He had said it the way he said it in 100 other situations. As a tool, as a pressure point, as the fastest available mechanism for ending a conversation that was going in the wrong direction. He had used it without examining it. The way you use any tool you've picked up enough times that the motion becomes automatic and the thought behind it goes quiet. He had said it to a man who had done nothing wrong. He had said it because the man had refused to make a difference possible. He had said it because authority, applied without thought, still felt like authority in the moment, like doing the job, like keeping order. He was beginning to understand that order and justice were not synonyms. He had used them interchangeably for 9 years. The galley phone rang. Captain Prescott answered it. She listened for 10 seconds. She said 3 words, "Put him through." Then she carried the receiver to the cabin and held it out toward Mr. Webb, our Vice President of Customer Operations. Marcus looked at the receiver. He remained in his seat. That detail mattered. He did not stand to take the call. He did not move toward the phone as if the authority on the other end required him to rise. He stayed in 3A and considered the receiver for a moment. "Put it on speaker, please," he said. Captain Prescott looked at him. He looked back. She pressed the button and held the receiver so the cabin could hear. The voice that came through had the quality of a man working very hard to sound composed, Mr. Webb. "This is Howard Stanton, Senior Vice President of Customer Operations for Pinnacle Airways. I want to start by, Mr. Stanton," Marcus said, "before you begin. I'd like you to tell me what you've been told about what happened on this aircraft." A pause. Brief but present. "I've been briefed that there was a seating issue." "That's not accurate," Marcus said. Silence on the line. "There was no seating issue," Marcus said. "I was in my assigned seat. The issue was that I was asked to leave it." Another pause. Longer. The whole cabin was motionless. Even the ambient sounds seemed to have reduced themselves out of courtesy to the conversation. "Mr. Webb," Howard said, more carefully now. "On behalf of Pinnacle Airways, I want to apologize for any confusion." "There was no confusion," Marcus said, flat. The word closing like a door, Howard adjusted. "I want to apologize for the way this situation was handled." "By whom?" Marcus asked, silence longer than the others. Because by whom was the sentence that changed everything. General apologies were designed to float. They gave everyone soft ground. "We're sorry this happened," Hems absorbed the weight and distributed it until no one was carrying anything specific. By whom required a different kind of answer. By whom had names in it. By whom meant the apology had to know what it was apologizing for. Howard Stanton had spent 22 years in corporate operations. He understood the difference between the two kinds of apologies at a structural level. He had written the first kind many times. He had almost never been asked to produce the second kind while a cabin full of passengers was listening. He said, "I want to apologize that Pinnacle Airways personnel asked you to vacate your confirmed first-class seat without reviewing your documentation, and that the situation was escalated in a manner that was not appropriate." Ruth Calloway pressed two fingers against her mouth, not performing, containing it. She had been waiting for a sentence with that shape, specific, named. Without the softening language that let the institution dissolve into fog, there it was. "And why did that happen?" Marcus asked. Howard went quiet. Captain Prescott watched Marcus with an expression that had shed every professional layer. She was simply watching. "The way you watch something you want to remember accurately, that will be determined through our internal review?" "No," Marcus said. "Your review will determine who participated. The reason is already visible in this cabin." He looked at Diana. He looked at Vernon. He looked at Richard Hargrove, who was staring at the window with the focus and intensity of a man trying to be absent from a room he was physically present in. "Mr. Hargrove assumed his expectation was worth more than my documented assignment," Marcus said. "Miss Thorne acted on that assumption without verification. Mr. Holt escalated my refusal to surrender my seat into a potential security matter. At each step, my boarding pass became less relevant, and the comfort of the person standing in the aisle became more relevant. That's not a seating issue. That's a decision about whose presence requires us justification, and whose presence is simply assumed to be correct, not loud, not angry. Each word placed with the care of someone who understood that precision was the enemy of revisionism. That the easier you let the language get, the easier it was to file and forget." Stents made a small sound, involuntary. She converted it into a clearing of her throat, but it wasn't that. Richard said, "That is not a fair characterization." Marcus turned to him, the kind of turn that was complete, that gave Richard the full weight of his attention without hostility and without warmth. "Just accuracy, fair," Marcus said, would have been sitting in 3C. Inside Diana Thorne's chest, something was happening that she did not yet have a name for. She would find the name later. In the parking lot of her apartment building, sitting in her car with the engine off for 20 minutes before she could make herself go inside. She would sit there in the dark, and the name would arrive quite quietly, without drama, the way the most accurate things often did. But right now it felt like standing on a floor she had trusted for 16 years, and discovering, midst, that the floor was built something she hadn't looked at directly. She thought about 3 years ago. A young man, business class, the Seattle route, Concourse C. He had filed a formal complaint after the flight, said Diana had treated him like someone who was sneaking into a seat he had legitimately purchased, like his presence in business class required explanations, in a way that other passengers' presence did not, that Madnustant had reviewed it. They called it a misunderstanding. They wrote a note, 5 lines, they filed it. Nothing changed. Diana had called it an overreaction. She had believed that with a comfortable certainty of someone who had never been given a reason to question it. She had moved on. She had continued doing the job the way she had always done the job, and the complaint had settled into the past where complaints went. She understood now what the word overreaction had done. It moved the problem from the act to the response. It made the person who named the harm responsible for the naming. It let the act sit quietly in a file folder, while the response got measured and judged and ultimately deemed excessive. Overreaction was one of the most efficient words in the language for ensuring that nothing had to change. It had let Diana Thorne go to work every day for 3 years without reconsidering a single assumption. She looked at her hands. Her uniform was still perfect. She always ironed it the night before and again in the morning. She had told herself since her first year with Pinnacle that looking right was evidence of doing right, that the precision of the presentation was proof of the precision of the person underneath it. She looked at her hands and she thought, "What exactly have I been presenting, T?" Not an answer, not yet, just the beginning of the question, which was, she would understand later, where the only useful thing started. Holt stared at the aisle carpet and thought about his daughters. He was 48 years old. He had 2 daughters. Amara was 21, pre-law at a university in Philadelphia. She called him every Sunday without fail and made him laugh every time. She was the sharpest person he knew, including every supervisor he had worked under in 9 years. His younger daughter, Deja, was 17 and had announced last spring that she wanted to be a teacher. She had said it at dinner with the particular certainty of someone who had already decided and was informing rather than discussing. He thought about what he would tell them if they asked about this morning. He ran through the version where he was still right, where the situation had simply escalated beyond what anyone intended, where the word security was a standard tool, applied routinely, nothing more. He ran through that version and it didn't hold. He thought, what if Amara had been seat 3A, his daughter, who called every Sunday, who was sharper than him and knew it and loved him anyway, who had never once in her 21 years given anyone a reason to question her right to occupy a space she'd for what? What if someone had said to Amara, the word security can become relevant here if you don't move. Vernon's hands were not shaking, but something in the center of his chest was doing something that had no clean name. It wasn't quite guilt. It was more like the feeling of having walked somewhere familiar and discovered, at the end of the route, that you had been going somewhere you didn't intend. He had used the institutional tools he had without examining the direction he was pointing them. He needed to say that out loud to someone, not for Marcus Webb's benefit. The harm to Marcus Webb was already a fact. It was documented. It was in the record. Saying sorry to Marcus Webb in this moment felt like arriving at a burning building with a glass of water. He needed to say it for the next flight, the next morning, the next time he walked down an aisle and read a room in a single pass and decided what he saw. Howard Stanton's voice came through the speaker again. Mr. Webb, the partnership between our organizations is of significant strategic importance. I want you to know that Pickleball takes this situation with the full seriousness it deserves. Marcus looked at the speaker mounted near the galley phone. Mr. Stanton, he said, integrity is strategically important. The partnership is paperwork. A beat, a long one. Then Howard said, we'll have the independent review confirmed in writing within the next few minutes. Captain Prescott looked at her watch. She noted the time. She would hold him to it. Marcus put the phone down on the tray table beside the business card. He had requested 3 things from himself when this began. 3 private commitments made in the 15 seconds between Diana's first approach and his first response. The first was not to stand up, not because standing was weak, but because standing would have given them something to point to. A disruption, a man who left the space, a man who could not hold his ground when pressure was applied. He had learned, long before this morning, that leaving was what they counted on. Leave and the story rewrote itself around the vacancy. Leave and the seat stayed empty, and nothing required explanation. He had not left. The second was not to perform anger. Anger was real. It moved through him in so persistent waves, the way it always did in these moments. The old ache accumulated and familiar. But anger displayed was anger they could catalog. They would name it, frame it, make it the subject instead of the object. Make him the dissusman rather than the response to one. He had felt it. He had not given it to them. The third was to say true things only, in the precise language of someone who understood that vagueness was the primary tool of institutional self-protection. Confusion was vague. Misunderstanding was vague. Unfortunate situation was designed to be vague. Vague language created space between action and consequence. His boarding pass had a seat number on it. The seat number was 3A. Diana Thorne had not reviewed it before asking him to move. These were not interpretations. These were feelings. These were facts with specific edges. He had said them clearly, and now the room was dealing with them. The minutes passed. Captain Prescott watched her watch. 3 minutes had been the commitment. She was 2 minutes 40 seconds in when the cabin phone rang again, and she answered it and listened and said, "Thank you. Stand by." She looked at the cabin. "Mr. Webb," she said, "Pinnacle Airways Executive Committee has confirmed an independent review panel will be appointed outside the customer operations chain. Written confirmation is being sent to your office and legal counsel now. All records from this flight, passenger service logbooks, crew tablet records, gate communications, cabin communications, operations notes, will be preserved pending the review's completion." Vivian's message arrived on Marcus's phone as Captain Prescott finished speaking. "Confirmation received. Board chair notified. Legal is standing by." Independent panel confirmed in writing. Do you want public relations on alert? He typed back, not yet. Facts first, he set phone face down. He looked at Vernon. You used the word security, Marcus said. You meant it as a lever. Vernon said nothing. I want you to understand something, Marcus said. Not for my sake. For every cabin you walk into after this one. When you reach for that word in a situation where no one is in danger. When you use it because it's fast and it closes conversations, you are not managing a situation. You are participating in one. Vernon's jaw was tight. I know, he said. It came out smaller than he had intended. Quieter, the voice of a man arriving somewhere he had been moving toward without realizing it. Marcus' heart heard it, not as a victory. There was nothing that felt like victory in this cabin. There was only the slow, expensive, necessary process of getting people to see what one person had been able to see from the beginning. The cost of that process was always paid by the person who saw it first. Ruth Calloway looked across the aisle. Marcus was looking out the window. His profile was composed. The silver watch caught the cabin light, in the set of his shoulders. In the absence of the tension that had compressed this cabin for nearly an hour, Ruth saw something she recognized. She had seen it in photographs. She had described it to students, with the particular quality of someone who has not been defeated, who has absorbed something genuinely hard, who has made it through the room without surrendering the thing the room was asking for. She opened her mouth, closed it, thought about what she wanted to say. She thought of a boy in the back row of her 11th grade class. Spring 2001, glasses, always chewing on his pencil. She had been teaching the Montgomery bus boycott. She had shown the class a photograph of Rosa Parks. She had asked, why does it matter that she didn't stand up? The boy with the pencil had said, because she made them deal with her. Ruth had written it on the board. She had used that sentence for 23 years in curriculum guides and graduation speeches and parent meetings. She had deployed it so many times it had become a thing she said rather than a thing she felt. The difference between those two things was she now understood enormous. This morning, watching Marcus Webb sit in seat 3A for 1 hour and 2 minutes, while the people around him applied every available instrument to the project of making him smaller, Ruth had felt it. The difference between the heard versions and the felt version was the entire distance between knowledge and understanding. Mr. Webb, she said. He turned from the window. She had both hands folded in her lap. She was not asking for his absolution. She was not performing remorse. She had the quality, Marcus thought, that distinguished genuine reckoning from its performance, the quietness of it, the absence of theater. I want to say something, Ruth said, and I want to say it correctly. All right, Marcus said. I stayed quiet for 17 minutes, she said. I told myself I was assessing. I told myself I didn't want to make it worse. I told myself. She stopped. I told myself a number of things. Marcus waited. They were all reasons, Ruth said. None of them were the reason. He looked at her. The reason, Ruth said, was that I wasn't certain what it would cost me. She said it without self-pity and without the dramatic intonation of someone performing accountability. Just the true sentence, placed between them. I'm 72 years old, she said. I taught students about courage for 34 years. And this morning I sat 3 feet from an injustice, and I calculated the personal expense before I said a word. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me today, he said. Ruth looked at him. That's a low bar, she said. And Marcus laughed. Not a performance, not a social reflex, the real kind. Short and genuine and since slightly surprised by itself. The kind that happens when something lands precisely where it was aimed. Ruth almost smiled. Almost. I should have spoken when it started, she said. Yes, Marcus said. He didn't soften it because she wasn't asking him to. But you spoke. Late counts. He looked at her. Late is not the same as never. Ruth nodded once. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she looked back. I've been thinking about that student, she said. The boy with the pencil. The one who said she made them deal with her. Marcus was very still. I used that sentence for over 2 decades, Ruth said. In speeches, in lesson plans. I said it until it became automatic, until it was a thing I could produce on demand. She looked at Marcus. This morning was the first time I understood what it cost the person who did the thing, rather than the person who described it afterward. The silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. Thank you, Marcus said, for feeling it. Ruth's eyes went bright. She didn't let them spill. But they went bright, Colby Reeves. In row 4 had lowered us finally. His arm had been raised for the better part of an hour, and the ache had moved from his shoulder into his neck. He checked the recording. It had captured everything, the geometry of the entire morning. Diana's first approach. Richard's voice saying just move the man with the flatness of someone describing weather. Vernon and the word security, the card on the tray table. Captain Prescott. Howard Stanton's specific and cornered apology. All of it, he had sent the file to the contact Sonia Brecht had given him before she left. Official documentation, authenticated, preserved. He had provided his name, his seat number, his contact information. He stood up. His legs were slightly unsteady. The particular metabolic aftermath of sustained adrenaline, the way it leaves the knees feeling borrowed from someone else. He walked to row 3. Marcus looked up. Colby had prepared something. A sentence. He had worked on it in his head for the past 15 minutes, and it had seemed adequate in there. Articulate. The right length. The right acknowledgement of what had happened. But standing in front of Marcus Webb, this man who had spent 62 minutes being exactly who he was, with no modification and no compromise. Colby's prepared sentence dissolved. So he said the true thing instead. I work with students who apologize before they ask for help, Colby said. Students who believe their needs are an inconvenience. Who have understood somewhere between childhood and being in my office that they need to earn the right to take up space. He stopped. I've spent 2 years trying to explain that they don't, that they already have it, that it isn't something anyone can grant them. Marcus listened. I've never known how to show them, Colby said. Until this morning, Mark got at him for a moment, but don't show them me, he said. Colby frowned. Show them Ruth, Marcus said. He'd gestured briefly across the aisle. Show them that 72 years old is not too late to do the right thing, and show them yourself. Show them that a 26-year-old with shaking hands and a phone is also a witness. That the witness is not always the person at the center. Sometimes the witness is the person who doesn't look away. Colby was quiet. My hands were shaking, he said. I know, Marcus said. You held it up anyway. Colby nodded. He didn't trust his voice enough to do more than that. He walked back to his seat and sat down and looked at the recording on his phone and thought about a student named Priya who had come to his office a Tuesday afternoon and prefaced every single sentence with, I'm sorry to bother you, but, while asking for help with a financial aid appeal that was entirely his responsibility to assist with. He was going to call her on Monday. He didn't know the exact words yet, but he had the shape of them now. The gate phone rang again. Denitra answered it. She listened. Her eyes moved to Captain Prescott. Corporate customer operations is sending a compliance representative to the gate, Denitra said. ETA approximately 10 minutes. Diana, near the galley, absorbed this. 10 minutes. Which meant this was not going to be resolved quietly and filed somewhere in the administrative middle distance where difficult mornings went to become less difficult over time. People with titles that included words like compliance and equity and executive incident response were now in motion. Which meant the category of mistake Diana was standing inside had been formally recognized by the institution that employed her. She looked at her uniform, still perfectly pressed. She had ironed it the night before and again that morning at 5:20. She had done this every working day for 16 years because she had decided early in her career that appearance was evidence, that the precision of the external was proof of something internal. She stood in the galley entrance and looked at the precision of her uniform and asked herself, for the first time in 16 years, what exactly the evidence was for. Captain Prescott addressed the cabin. She stood at the forward end of first class and spoke to every passenger present. Her voice was measured and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience this morning. I want to acknowledge directly that what occurred in this cabin did not meet the standard of respect that every Pinnacle Airways passenger deserves. The incident has been formally documented. It will be reviewed completely and independently. We will be departing once that process is appropriately underway. No one clapped. It was better that way. Some moments were too serious for applause. The applause would have made it smaller, given it an ending. Made it the kind of thing you could package and release and move past on the way to next thing. This was not that kind of thing. The corporate compliance representative arrived in 9 minutes. Her name was Sonia Brecht. She came through the jet bridge door with a pinnacle blazer, a lanyard carrying more cards than seemed practical, and the expression of someone who had sprinted through O'Hare while maintaining professional posture. She spoke briefly with Deetra at the door. She spoke briefly with Captain Prescott. She scanned the cabin once, quick, thorough, reading the room the way the room needed to be read, and then did something that none of the staff had done in the first 40 minutes of this incident. She walked directly to seat 3A. "Mr. Webb," she said, "my name is Sonia Brecht. I'm from Pinnacle's Corporate Equity and Compliance Division. I've been briefed on the incident. I want to ask you directly, is there anything you need right now before we continue?" Marcus looked at her. He looked for the angle, the institutional softening that sometimes dressed itself as directness. He looked carefully, and he found he was careful because he had been wrong in this assessment before. Nothing of the kind. Just a woman who had run through O'Hare to ask what he needed. "I'm fine," he said. "I want this documented completely. It will be," she said. He believed her, tentatively, which was more than this morning had given him reason to expect. She moved efficiently through the cabin. Forms were produced and distributed. Vern sat in the forward seat and filled out his statement with the slowness of someone's measuring words, which was appropriate. Some sentences deserved that kind of care. Richard Hargrove sat in 3C and did not look out the window anymore. He looked at his hands, the gold watch on his left wrist. He had bought it in Geneva 11 years ago. It had cost more than his first car. For 11 years, it had been a certain kind of evidence of distance traveled, a position achieved, of the gap between the apartment above the dry cleaner in Akron, Ohio, and the life he had built since. He looked at it now, and it was still the same watch, but it felt like a different kind of object than it had been this morning. He didn't know exactly what kind. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out immediately. But the question was there now, sitting in his chest alongside something that was not quite guilt and not quite remorse, and was possibly the precondition for both. He looked across the aisle. Marcus Webb was looking out the window. Coquet. Still, the silver watch loose on his wrist, the cards still on the tray table, the boarding pass folded back into his jacket, the posture of a man who had been exactly himself for the past hour and had no intention of being anything else. Richard looked at him for a long time. Marcus did not look back. Which was, Richard understood, simply his right. Constance had not spoken to Richard since sitting down. Her leather bag was in her lap, but she was not holding it the way she usually did. She was just letting it rest there. Like something she was in the process of reconsidering. The silence between them was familiar in its shape, but not in its content. This was a different silence than the one they usually occupied together. The kind that happened when two people had agreed, without saying so, that something required thinking about before it required talking about. Cecilia came to row 3 once more. She sat briefly in the seat across the aisle and spoke quietly. "Mr. Webb, the independent review panel is confirmed in writing. Legal has received the documentation. The board chair's office has acknowledged receipt of your notification." The Hargroves, Marcus said. Sonia met his eyes. "Were present for documented discriminatory conduct," she said. "Their role in initiating the incident is part of the formal record." "That's sufficient," Marcus said. Sonia looked at him with the expression of someone who had done this work long enough to know the difference between people who wanted punishment and people who wanted accountability. The difference mattered. Punishment was retrospective. Accountability was structural. One satisfied something, the other changed something. "Is there anything else you need directly from me?" she asked. "Make sure the passengers who recorded and spoke up are protected," Marcus said. "No retaliation. Not formal, not informal. Not the quiet kind that doesn't show up in records already documented," Sonia said. "All of them." She stood. She extended her hand. Marcus shook it. "Safe flight, Mr. Webb," she said. "Thank you, Ms. Brecht," he said. She walked toward the door, and Marcus watched her go with the particular respect he reserved for people who showed up and did the actual work, rather than the appearance of it. The cabin clock on the forward panel read 7:58 a.m. 1 hour and 11 minutes since boarding had begun. Outside the windows, the rain had softened, not stopped, softened. The drumming on the terminal glass had dropped to something more like white noise. The runway lights blurred at the edges, smeared by the water on the glass into gold and silver lines. Marcus looked at the tray table, the card. His own name, the title. The company he had built out of exactly the kind of experience this morning had provided him. The platform designed to make visible what institutions preferred to keep in the comfortable dark of aggregate statistics. He picked up the card, returned it to the holder. The leather was warm from the cabin air. He was thinking about his father again, not the restaurant. A different memory. Leonard in the hospital, 4th floor. The room that faced the parking structure. His father's hands on the blanket, the same wide hands, the same cracked knuckles, but stilled now by illness into something quieter. Leonard's voice had been slower toward the end, but still him. Still the economy. Still the habit of saying important things with the fewest syllables available. "I won't see what you build," Leonard had said. Not sad, just accurate, the way Leonard was always accurate. "But I know you won't bow to it, whatever it is, whoever it is. I know you won't." Marcus had not answered with words. He had held his father's hand. Leonard had accepted that, which was from Leonard Webb. Everything Ruth Calloway. In row 2 had taken out a small notebook, spiral-bound, blue cover. She had been using the same style for 30 years. She had filled hundreds of them with things she didn't want to forget. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote the date. She sat with the pen hovering. Then she wrote, "He made them deal with him." She looked at the sentence for a moment. She added, "And I almost didn't help." She looked at that one longer. She added, "Late is not the same as never." She closed the notebook, put it back in her bag, looked out the window at the gray Chicago sky, the city grid below softening in the rain. She was thinking about Monday. She was going to call her former colleague Janet, who still taught at the school in Columbus. She was going to ask if she could come in, not to teach a unit, to tell a story. About a first-class cabin and a man in a navy suit and the 17 minutes Ruth Calloway had spent calculating what it might cost her to say something obviously true. She was going to tell Janet's students that they would face moments like this, not in textbooks. In airports and offices and grocery stores and bus stops and every ordinary place where ordinary days either rose to the occasion or quietly failed it, she was going to tell them. The cost of silence is paid by someone else. She had known that sentence for 34 years. She knew it differently now. Diana Thorne was escorted off the aircraft at 8:04 a.m. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or public confrontation or the theatrical machinery of institutional punishment. A Pinnacle supervisor arrived through the jet bridge door, a man named Garrett, whom Diana had worked alongside on the Atlanta route for 3 years, and there was a brief quiet conversation near the forward galley. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Then Diana nodded once. She gathered nothing because she had nothing to gather. Her bag was already in the galley. She picked it up. She walked toward the door. She still looked exactly right. That was the strange part. The part that Marcus, who did not watch her go but was aware of her departure, the way you were aware of things at the periphery of your attention, registered without turning his head. Uniform pressed. Hair pulled back without a strand displaced. The Pinnacle wings on her lapel perfectly level. 16 years of looking exactly right had become so complete, so thoroughly habituated, that even now the exterior held without effort. She looked like a flight attendant at the beginning of a shift, not the end of one. She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. Not quite. But she paused. One hand on the doorframe. For 2 seconds, she stood in the threshold between the aircraft and the jet bridge, not fully in either place, in the space between where she had been and wherever came next. Marcus was looking out the window at the wet tarmac, but he felt the pause. The way you felt things that happened at the edge of perception. Not seen, sensed. And he thought, without satisfaction, without relief, without the particular pleasure that people sometimes mistook for justice. She stopped. People who felt nothing did not stop. The pause was something. He didn't know yet what it would become. A week from now, a month, a year. He didn't know whether Diana Thorne would spend the rest of her career carrying what had happened in this cabin as information or as burden. He didn't know whether the pause in the doorway was the first breath of a genuine reckoning, or simply the involuntary hesitation of someone who had not yet finished deciding what this morning meant. But she stopped, and stopping, even briefly, even at the edge of a threshold, was its own kind of data. Then she stepped through the door, and was gone. The jet bridge received her. The terminal would receive her after that. And the long, uncomfortable work of figuring out what came next would begin in whatever private space she found for it. Marcus hoped she found one. He hoped she used it. That was the furthest his generosity could reach right now, and he was honest with himself about the distance. Vernon Holt remained on the aircraft. Captain Prescott had told him, quietly, near the forward galley, that he would provide a complete written statement before departure, and that operations would determine his state pending review. Vernon had nodded. He had returned to the forward jump seat, and he was still there, working through the statement with the slowness someone who had decided that this document deserved more care than anything he had written in 9 years. He was writing sentences he had never expected to write, about what he saw when he walked down the aisle, about what he decided before gathering information, about the word he used and the situation it was not appropriate for. He was writing them slowly because the sentences needed to be accurate, and he had spent the last 90 minutes understanding at a level that went past the professional and into something more personal what the cost of inaccuracy was. He would speak with compliance directly. He had requested it. Not because someone told him to, because there would be other flights, other mornings, other cabins, and he needed those mornings to be different from this one. That was the only useful thing he could do with what he now knew. The forward galley, alone for a few minutes before Garrett returned to begin the formal process. Diana stood between the coffee service cart and the overhead supply cabinet and did something she rarely permitted herself. She thought without a destination. Deanna Thorne was a practical person. She had built her professional life on the efficiency of directed thought, problem identification, response selection, execution. She had applied this to 16 years of in-flight situations with reliable results. She was good at her job. She had been good at her job for a long time. She stood in the galley, and for the first time in a very long, while she let her thoughts move without directing them. They moved toward the young man from Seattle 3 years ago, business class. The complaint he had filed afterward. She had read it once quickly. The way you read things you had already decided were not worth extended attention. He had said she treated him like he was attempting to access a space he had not legitimately purchased, like his presence in business class required a different level of scrutiny than the presence of other passengers. Madnosh had called it a misunderstanding, 5 lines in a file. Diana had called it an overreaction and moved on. She stood in the galley now, and she thought about the word overreaction and what it had done. Not what she had intended it to do, what it had actually done. It had made the young man's response to the harm the subject of the conversation rather than the harm itself. It had moved the weight from the act to the naming of the act. It had allowed Diana to walk out of that review with her story about herself intact. Professional, precise, treating every passenger according to the same standard. The story had been useful. She stood in the galley and looked at the card and understood with the specific clarity that arrived too late and landed anyway, that the story had been more useful than it was true. She thought about Marcus Webb sits in seat 3A for 62 minutes. He had not shouted at her. He had not insulted her. He had not performed the distress or the anger that would have given her something to categorize and respond to with trained efficiency. He had simply stayed in his seat, and asked people to say out loud what they were doing. And that, the stillness of it, the precision of it, the complete absence of anything she could point to as the problem, had been more destabilizing than any confrontation she had managed in 16 years. Because you could not diffuse what was not explosive. You could not contain what had never lost control. You could only stand in front of it and eventually understand that the problem was not the man in the seat, she thought. How many times? Not as accusation. The accusation would come later, in stages, the way genuine reckonings arrived, in layers, over time. Requiring repeated returns to the same material before it gave up what it actually contained, for now. How many times? How many times had she read a situation from the outside and decided what it was before she gathered information that would have told her? How many young men from Seattle were in the file? How many complaints called misunderstandings? How many overreactions? She didn't know the number, but she could feel the weight of it. That was enough to begin. Garrett came back through the galley curtain with the forms. Diana took them. She sat on the jump seat and began to write. She wrote slowly. Which was, she had learned this morning, what honesty required. Lorraine Hayes arrived at 8:09 a.m. She came through the jet bridge door the way she did everything, without announcement and without performance. She had been a pinnacle flight attendant for 21 years. Premium cabin for 11 of them. She was 54, with short, natural hair gone silver at the temples, and she moved through the aircraft door with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this, long enough to know that the first thing a disrupted cabin needed was not a speech. It needed someone to do the job. She came down the aisle without surveying the scene, with the self-conscious awareness of someone entering a situation. She simply walked. The way you walked when you understood your purpose and were not interested in being noticed for it. She stopped at row 3. "Mr. Webb," she said, "my name is Lorraine. I'll be taking care of this cabin today." A pause, calibrated, the exact length of a breath. "Can I get you some water?" Marcus looked at her. He looked at her the way you looked at something you were not expecting and were not yet sure how to receive. Not with suspicion, with a careful, open attention. Because after Diana and Vernon and the word security and Howard Stanton's measured and cornered apology, and the institutional machinery that had spent the past hour and a half going through the first-class cabin of a flight that still had not departed, after all of that. Here was a woman who had asked if he wanted water, not performing remorse for the institution she represented. Not auditioning for his forgiveness or his understanding, not prefacing the question with an apology or a disclaimer or an acknowledgement of the broader context. Just, "Can I get you some water?" The ordinary thing. The thing that should have been the beginning of this morning rather than something arriving near its end. "Yes," Marcus said. "Thank you." She went to the galley. She came back. She set the water on his tray table without ceremony, without the slight over-deliberateness of someone performing a symbolic act. She set it down the way you'd set down a glass of water, practically, without theater. She asked if he needed anything else. He said no. She moved to the next passenger with the same unhurried precision, checked the seat belt, asked about the overhead vent, did the actual work of the cabin with the quiet focus of someone whose relationship to the job had never required an audience. Marcus looked at the glass. Something shifted in his chest, not dramatically. Not the way shifts were depicted in films, with their swelling music and their close-ups of faces resolving into understanding. Just a centimeter. The specific physical release that happened when pressure equalized. When the thing pressing from one side and the thing pressing from the other finally matched, and the door between them eased open. He had not expected to be moved by a glass of water. But he was, because it was not about the water. It was about the fact that Lorraine Hayes had walked into a complicated room and done the simple thing without making the simple thing complicated. Without borrowing weight from everything that had preceded her. Without needing the simplicity to mean something beyond itself. He had been asking for that since 6:47 a.m. He thought about his father again. Not the restaurant, not the hospital. An ordinary Sunday. Leonard at the kitchen table in the apartment on Halsted Street. Second coffee. Newspaper folded in half, the way he always folded it, the way Marcus had never managed to replicate exactly. Looking out the window at the alley. The particular quality of a Sunday morning before anything was required of anyone. Marcus had been maybe 12. Leonard had said without looking away from the window. "You know what the best thing about you is?" Marcus had said no. "You stay," Leonard said. "When things get hard, you don't go looking for the door. You stay and you figure it out." He hadn't said it as a compliment. He had said it as a fact. The way Leonard stated all things that mattered. Not with sentiment layered on top. Just the thing itself, stated plainly, given to Marcus to carry. Marcus had carried it. He had carried it into the waiting room, where he sat for 3 hours and 11 minutes. Into every conference room, where the handshakes happened before anyone knew what he had built. Into the restaurant in Lincoln Park, with the white tablecloths and the table next to the trash. Into every room that had looked at him and decided something before it knew anything. He had stayed. He had figured it out. He had built trident civic systems out of the accumulated clarity of having stayed in rooms that would have preferred his absence. A company that existed to make visible what institutions arranged themselves to keep invisible. Not out of anger. Out of the conviction, inherited from Leonard Webb's loading dock, and Leonard Webb's second dress shirt, and Leonard Webb's 20% tip on a birthday dinner he could not quite afford, that the truth had to be named before it could be changed. You named it. Then you built something. That was the whole inheritance. The aircraft door closed at 8:31 a.m. That sound, the heavy pneumatic seal of a commercial aircraft door. Marcus had heard it hundreds of times, but this time it carried something different. Not in the sound itself, in what the sound meant. The formal separation between the morning that it happened and the forward motion that came next. The jet bridge retracted, the boarding lights extinguished, and the first-class cabin of Pinnacle Airways Flight 826, which had been, for the past 104 minutes, a location where something genuinely difficult had occurred and been imperfectly, incompletely, but actually reckoned with, became simply a cabin again. Lorraine moved through it with the grace of someone for whom grace was not a performance but a habit. She checked seatbelts. She offered pillows. She adjusted overhead vents for the passengers who asked. She did all of it with the same unhurried attention. Nothing compensatory.
Nothing theatrical.
Just the work. Just the ordinary, sustaining, taken-for-granted work of treating people like people. The engines deepened that second sound. When the thrust moved from idle to intention, when the aircraft committed, Marcus felt it in his chest the way he always did. Not nervousness, something older. The physiological memory of every flight that had preceded this one accumulating into a kind of bodily recognition. The aircraft moved, backward first, the pushback, the slow withdrawal from the gate, the brief disorientation of moving in the wrong direction before the turn that pointed you toward where you were actually going. Marcus looked out the window. Chicago retreated, the terminal glass, the gate numbers, the yellow-jacketed ground crew giving signals with illuminated wands, their movements precise and practiced in the rain. All of it sliding past, all of it diminishing in the way that distance diminished things without changing what they had been. He had been in that terminal for 47 minutes before boarding. He had been in that cabin for 104 minutes before pushback. 151 minutes in which his boarding pass had been disregarded, his presence questioned, his right to occupy a space he had paid for, treated as a problem in need of a solution. 151 minutes, and he had not left. He rested his left hand on his knee, the silver watch loose against his wrist. He ran his thumb across the face of it without looking down, the small scratch at the bottom right of the crystal, his father's workbench. Leonard had knocked the watch against the corner of it once years ago and looked at the mark and laughed that short private laugh he had when something reminded him that objects didn't care about your plans for them. Still keeps perfect time, Leonard had said. Like that was the point. Like that was the only thing that mattered about anything. Marcus thought, yes, the aircraft taxied toward the runway. The rain had softened sin further, not stopped. The windows were still streaked with it, the terminal receding into a smear of lights and structure and wet gray morning. He was thinking about his father, not the restaurant, not the kitchen table, the hospital, fourth floor, the window that faced the parking structure. Leonard's hands on the blanket, the same hands Marcus had watched his entire childhood, wide and rough and cracked at the joints, now stilled by illnesses into something quieter. The specific economy of Leonard's vivsomely near the end. Slower, but still him. Still saying the essential things with the fewest possible words, because anything more would have been a form of extravagance Leonard Webb did not practice. I won't see what you build, Leonard had said. Not sad. Accurate. Leonard had made his peace with the fact that could not be changed and reserved everything else for the things that could. But I know you won't bow to it. Whatever it is. Whoever it is, Marcus had held his father's hand. Leonard had accepted that as the answer it was. Marcus pressed his thumb against the watch face. He did not cry. But for a moment, just a moment, in the privacy of a window seat while the aircraft found its place in the taxi queue, the pressure behind his eyes was real, and he did not perform his way around it. He let it be present. He let it exist as what it was, because feeling it was not the same as losing to it. And Leonard had taught him that too. In the specific way Leonard taught everything. Not by saying it, but by demonstrating it. By tipping 20% on a dinner he couldn't afford and driving home in silence and saying one true sentence and never crying about the table in the back. By staying, by figuring it out. Deciding that his son's future was worth more than his own present anger. That was not weakness. That was the hardest kind of strength. The kind that didn't announce itself. The kind that got mistaken by people who hadn't paid close attention. for acceptance. It was not acceptance, it was strategy. It was love with a 35-year timeline. Marcus breathed, fully. The way you breathed when something had been compressed for a long time and the pressure finally, not disappeared, but redistributed. When the weight was still there, but the angle changed and carrying it became possible again. The aircraft reached the runway threshold, the engines changed again. The sound of commitment. The sound of speed becoming inevitable. And Marcus Webb sat in seat 3A, the seat he had paid for, the seat they had decided he did not deserve, the seat that had become, without his designing it, the location of something that would exist in a record beyond this morning. And he let the acceleration press him gently back, and he watched Chicago become geometry below the wings, and he thought, I wish you could have seen this, Dad. Not the corporate apology, not the suspended contract, not the independent review panel with its formal language and its bureaucratic weight. Not any of the institutional machinery that had slowly, reluctantly, imperfectly engaged. He wished his father could have seen the way he sat. Just that the way he had stayed in the seat for 104 minutes and not given them the exit they were counting on. Because Leonard Webb had spent 31 years on a loading dock swallowing things so his son would not have to. Had spent 30 years making himself useful and invisible, and had carried, in the private interior of his own chest, the weight of a world that had arranged itself around an assumption about what he was worth, what he was allowed to want, where he was permitted to sit, and Leonard had borne it, not from weakness, from love, from the specific, costly, uncelebrated sacrifice of a man who decided that what came after him mattered more than what was being done to him now. You won't have to swallow the things I swallowed. Marcus had not swallowed this morning. And somewhere in the accumulated distance between Leonard Webb's loading dock and Seat 3A on Pinnacle Airways Flight 826, that sentence had been paid forward in full. The aircraft climbed through the cloud layer, and Chicago disappeared. Everything became gray, and then white, and then the particular luminous formlessness of being above weather. The altitude where the ground was gone, and the sky had not yet become itself fully, and theirs was only this. The steady hum of engines, and the pale light coming through the oval windows, and the specific suggestion of being neither here nor there at several hundred miles an hour. Marcus looked out the window, his phone lit up. A message from Vivian, independent panel confirmed. Partnership review official suspended, pending things. Board chair's office has everything. Legal is standing by. Do you need anything from me tonight? He typed back, no, thank you. Get some sleep. A second message arrived in a separate thread from a number he didn't immediately recognize. Then he placed it. Sonia Brecht, the corporate equity office. Mr. Webb, the recording from the passenger in row 4 is secure and authenticated with official timestamps. All crew statements are filed. Written notification has been sent to Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove regarding their role in the documented incident. Should you wish to pursue further action, the complete documentation supports it. Should you not to, that is equally valid. This decision belongs to you. This office will follow your lead. He read it twice. Your decision. He looked at those two words for a moment, because that was what had been absent from this entire morning. Every person who had approached him, Diana, Vernon, Richard, Howard Stanton on the speakerphone, had framed the situation as something he needed to resolve by surrendering his position. They had given him the shape of a decision without the content of one, the form of agency without the substance. Move, cooperate. Help us help everyone by making yourself smaller, and underneath all of it, the things did not say directly. Make this easier for us. Now, finally, someone was returning the decision to him and meaning it. He typed, I'll be in touch after the panel's findings. Thank you for your work this morning. He set the phone face down. He looked out the window at the white expanse above the clouds. Past the pale formlessness of high altitude to where the sky began to shade. At the horizon, from white to the faintest possible blue. The color that existed at the edge of seeing. The color that appeared before you were certain it was there. He thought about what he wanted from this. It was not a question he asked himself often in real time. The building of Trident had required a particular discipline of do over wanting. You didn't build what he had built by spending significant time in the question of what you wanted. You identified what needed to exist. You built it. You moved to the next thing that needed to exist. But here, above the clouds, with the morning below him and the day ahead still a blank. What did he want? He wanted accountability. He had that. The documentation, the independent panel, the preserved records, the formal notification to the Hargroves, the written confirmation from Howard Stanton that named specifically what had been done and who had participated. He wanted the thing to not disappear. Captain Prescott had promised him that. He believed her to the degree that the morning had earned, which was more than nothing and less than certainty, which was where belief usually lived when it was being honest about itself. He wanted people to look. That was the deepest one, the one underneath the others, not at him. That was not what he meant, and he was precise with himself about what he meant. He wanted people to look at the mechanism, the way Diana Thorne had walked down an aisle and formed a conclusion before collecting any information. The way Vernon Holt had reached for the word security in a situation that contained no threat. The way a first-class cabin had held 17 passengers, and 16 of them had done the careful, practiced work of not quite seeing what was happening in front of them. He wanted that examined, not punished. Exactly. Punishment satisfied something but didn't necessarily change anything. Punishment could exist alongside the unchanged mechanism, could even reinforce the mechanism by giving it a completed transaction, a ledger entry, or zine to stop looking. Examination was different. Examination was what changed the mechanism itself. His father had understood this. Leonard Webb had not taught his sons to burn things down. He had taught him to see clearly, to name accurately, to refuse to absorb the story a room was trying to tell about who he was, and then to build something. You named it, and then you built something from the naming. Marcus had built Trident Civic Systems from exactly that curriculum. A company that existed to make visible what institutions preferred to keep in the comfortable space between intention and outcome. A platform that looked at the numbers and traced the patterns and said, here is what your data shows about how you treat people differently, along lines you would not openly name. Here is the gap between your stated values and your actual practice. Here is what the mechanism looks like when you stop looking away from it. He had built the mirror, and this morning, the mirror had been in the room before he ever produced the business card. He was the mirror. He had always been the mirror. That was what they had actually been trying to move from seat 3A, not a passenger. Reflection, Ruth Calloway. In row 2 was writing in her notebook. She had opened it to the blank page she had begun earlier, and she was writing now with more ease than she had then. The pen moved. The thoughts arrived already shaped. She wrote about the boy with the pencils and the sentence she had used for 23 years without understanding its full weight. She wrote about 17 minutes of calculation. She wrote about the specific difference between knowing something and feeling it, and how she had spent 34 years teaching the former while assuming the latter would follow. She wrote, the cost of silence is paid by someone else. She underlined it. Not for emphasis, for memory. She looked out the window. Iowa below them now, probably. The patchwork of farmland visible through a break in the clouds. The country spread out in its ordinary, vast, complicated particularity. She would call Janet on Monday. She would ask to come in. She would sit in the front of a classroom that was not hers anymore, and she would tell the story of a morning in a first-class cabin, and what it had cost her to say something that should have taken no courage at all. She would tell the students, you will face these moments, not in history books, in the present tense, in your lives. In the spaces between the historical moments that get named and photographed and taught in units, she would tell them, the present tense is where it happens. The present tense is where you either do the thing or you don't. She had almost not done it. She needed them to know that too, that it was possible to have taught courage for 34 years and still needs 17 minutes to locate your own. That the gap between the knowledge and the practice was real and not shameful and had to be crossed every time, in every new present tense moment, without the guarantee that you would get there faster than you had before. That late was not the same as never. That you closed the notebook, and you made the call on Monday, and you went back into the classroom you had left, because the teaching was not finished just because the career was. Richard Hargrove's eyes were closed. He was doing the thing he rarely gave himself permission to do, thinking without a predetermined conclusion, following a thread before knowing where it ended. It was uncomfortable. He was not a man who valued discomfort. He had spent 59 years arranging his circumstances to minimize it. He was thinking about Akron, the apartment above the dry cleaner on Copley Road. The smell of chemical solvent that lit in everything, regardless of how often his mother opened the windows. His father driving the night route on the transit system. His mother working double shifts at the hospital laundry, coming home with her hands red from the water and the industrial soap. He was thinking about the rooms that hadn't been designed for people like his family. The particular temperature of those rooms. The say certain spaces communicated without words, that your presence was conditional. That it required a level of justification that other presences did not. He had spent 41 years getting far enough from that apartment on Copley Road that he no longer had to feel that temperature. He had spent 41 years not feeling it. He opened his eyes. He looked at the seat back in front of him. He thought, I created that temperature this morning, not as a decision he had examined and made deliberately. He had walked into a first-class cabin and seen a man in a seat that his eyes, before his brain had fully arrived, had registered as incorrectly occupied. And he had acted on that registration, in front of his wife, in front of a cabin full of strangers, in front of a phone that was still recording, and the man he had acted against had sat seat for all 104 minutes and not moved, and had done it with a quality that Richard recognized now, sitting in seat 3C, that he had not recognized when he was standing in the aisle. He recognized it because he had seen it once before, in his father who had driven the transit bus on the night route for 22 years and had never once, in Richard's memory, complained about the specific temperature of the rooms that had arranged themselves against him, who had come home in the early hours and eaten whatever was left in the refrigerator and slept for 5 hours and gone back, who had done this with a quality that young Richard had interpreted as acceptance, and that Richard at 59, sitting in seat 3C, understood for the first time was something else entirely. It was dignity, not the performed kind, not the announced kind. The kind that required nothing from the room it occupied, the kind that existed whether or not anyone had it, the kind that did not ask for permission and did not require an audience. His father had greeted his entire life, and Richard had spent 41 years running from the circumstances that had required it. In the belief that escape was the same as progress, he thought, I became what I was running from. Not with those words exactly. The thought didn't arrive in neat sentences. It arrived as a feeling, and the feeling had that particular shape when he tried to describe it to himself. He looked at his hands, the gold watch on his left wrist, the evidence of distance traveled. He thought, distance is not the same as change. He had not finished the thought. He did not know yet what finishing it would require, but he was sitting with it in a way that he had not sat with anything uncomfortable in a very long time. Not pushing it away, not converting it into something more manageable. Just sitting with it and letting it have its actual weight. Constance had her hand on his arm. She had not said anything since they sat down. She didn't need to. 27 years of marriage had given them a fluency in silence that was more complete than most people's fluency in speech. She knew which silence meant leave me alone and which meant stay. This one meant stay. Richard put his hand over hers. They didn't speak, but something moved between them. The specific understanding that passed between two people who had been uncomfortable for a long time and had just been made briefly, sharply, unavoidably uncomfortable. Who had been given, without asking for it, a view of something they had not known they were not seeing. It was not the same as change. But it was, possibly, the condition required for it. The clouds closed beneath the aircraft. Everything outside became white. Lorraine appeared beside row 3. Can I get you anything before we level off? She asked. Marcus looked up. Actually, he said. Yes, she waited. Tell me something good, he said. She looked at him for a moment, not puzzled, understanding exactly what he meant. The human need after something that had required sustained effort to be reminded that the world contained other registers, other textures, other things happening simultaneously in the enormous ordinary life of the world that had nothing to do with what had happened in this cabin. She thought for 3 seconds. My niece was born 4 days ago, she said. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. They named her Della. My sister called me from the hospital before my shift started, and I could hear her in the background. She wasn't crying. She was making this sound. Lorraine paused, as if listening to the memory of it. Like she was announcing something. Marcus looked at her. "That's very good," he said. "I thought so," Lorraine said. She smiled. Real, small. The kind that came from somewhere specific rather than from the general region of professional warmth. "I'll get you some more water," she said. She went. Marcus leaned back in the seat. He let the hum of the engine settle into something that was not quite sound anymore, but simply presence. The aircraft's steady insistence on altitude, on forward motion, on getting from here to there the way aircraft did, through weather and above it and despite it, without ceremony. He was thinking about what he had come onto this aircraft as a man traveling to a business meeting. He was leaving it as the same man. That was the part people sometimes missed about mornings like this. They expected transformation, a crucible narrative, a man who arrived one thing and departed another, who gained something in the fire or lost something irreplaceable. But Marcus had been whole when he boarded. He was whole now. The morning had not made him. He had not needed it to. He had walked on to Flight 826 already carrying what Leonard Webb had spent 31 years on a loading dock building into him. The Mayhaw that had given him anything he didn't already have. It had simply required him to use it, in public. In front of phones and witnesses and a vice president on speakerphone and a 72-year-old history teacher and a 26-year-old counselor whose hands had shaken but who had held the lens steady anyway. He had used what his father gave him. And now it was in the record. Now it existed in a place outside his own chest. Now it was something the world had to deal with. He looked out the window, past the white cloud layer, past the pale, formless altitude, to the horizon, where the sky shaded from white to a blue, so faint it existed at the edge of color. The blue that came before you were certain it was there. The aircraft leveled off. The cabin lights adjusted automatically. The subtle shift from the brightness of ascent to the softer register of cruise. The sounds changed too. The engine settling from the sustained effort of climb into the long patience of altitude. Below them, somewhere past the clouds, the country continued. Iowa, probably. Nebraska after that. The middle of the country that was mostly not visible from the routes people flew over it. The towns and fields and lives that existed beneath the flight paths without being seen by the people on them. The Colby Reeves had his earbuds in. He was not listening to anything. He was looking at the pocket in the seat back in front of him. The safety card. The recycling guide. The small diagram of a human figure in the brace position, drawn with the minimal lines that were all safety instructions were allowed. He was thinking about a sentence that had arrived in his head, complete and specific, sometime in the past 2 hours. "You are allowed to take up the space that is actually yours." He had said this to students before, many times. In his office, in group sessions, in the hallway conversations that sometimes contained more than the scheduled appointments. He had said it, but this morning he had watched a man live it, had watched him live it for 104 minutes under sustained pressure from multiple directions, with no performance and no compromise and no exit taken. The dip between the heard version and the lived version was, Colby understood now, the entire distance between education and understanding. He was going to call Pri on Monday. He was going to tell her. Not about Marcus Webb specifically, because that was not his story to tell, but about the thing he had understood this morning. About the difference between apologizing before asking and simply asking. About the fundamental distinction between presence that required justification and presence that did not. He was going to tell her that the apology was not required, that she was already allowed, that the space was hers before anyone confirmed it. Ruth closed her notebook. She put it in her bag. She looked out the window at the white below them and the blue beginning above. She thought about Janet, about the classroom, about the students who were currently in not knowing that a woman who used to teach them was on a plane above Iowa composing what she was going to say when she came back. She was going to tell them about the present tense. She was going to tell them that history was not something that had already happened. History was happening. It was happening in airports and offices and on transit buses and in hospital laundries and in restaurants in Lincoln Park, where a man named Leonard Webb took his son on a birthday and was seated next to the trash and tipped 20% and drove home in the dark and said one sentence that his son carried for 35 years. She was going to tell them that the photograph did not capture the 17 minutes before the moment. The 17 minutes were the story, too. She was going to tell them that. And then she was going to tell them what she had done with hers. Marcus looked at the horizon. The blue was certain now, not at the edge of visibility. Present. The specific blue that lived above weather, above cloud cover, above the compressed difficulty of morning. The blue that had been there all along while everything below it was gray. His phone lit up once more. A brief final message from Vivian by chair sends his regards. Says to tell you, he would have stayed in the seat too. Marcus read it once. Put the phone face down on the armrest. He looked at the scratch on the watch face, the specific small mark that had been there for years, and that he had never considered having repaired. Because the watch worked. Because the scratch was part of what made it the watch it was. Because Leonard Webb had laughed when it happened and said it still keeps perfect time, and Marcus had never found a reason to disagree. He rested his hand over it. He breathed fully. The way you breathed when something had been pressing against you for a long time, and the pressure finally found another direction. When the beat itself didn't seem sagged that could get carried rather than survived. The review would take weeks. The institutional reckoning would take longer. Diana Thorne was beginning a process she had not prepared for and could not predict the end of. Vernon Holt was writing sentences that would require more sentences after them. Richard Hargrove was sitting in the correct seat for the first time all morning and was in the early stages of understanding what that cost him. Constance was sitting beside her husband with her hand on his arm and was in the early stages of understanding what it cost her too. None of that was finished. None of it was clean. Some things that mattered were never clean. They were ongoing. They were the long work of institutions and individuals reckoning, slowly and imperfectly, with what they had built and what it had done and what they intended to do about it. Marx was part of that work now. His documentation was part of it. His refusal to stand up was part of it. The recording on Colby Reeves's phone was part of it. Ruth Calaplante's blue notebook was part of it. Sonia Brecht's folder of statements was part of it. Small things. Collectively, they were a weather system. He had learned that from his father's loading dock, some victories did not feel like celebrations. Some victories felt like the full breath after a long time of not quite getting enough air. Like the realization, quiet and specific and private, that you had stayed in a room that wanted you to leave, and the room had been required, slowly and reluctantly and imperfectly, to reckon with who you were. The engines hummed. The blue deepened at the horizon. Lorraine set a fresh glass of water on his tray table without being asked. She moved past him and on through the cabin without pausing, the way you moved through work, understood. Marcus looked at the glass. He looked out the window, seat 3A. Window seat. The clouds were below them now, and the sun was coming in from the left side of the aircraft, and the light on the wing was the clean, particular gold of altitude. The light that existed above weather, that had been there all along. Marcus Webb sat in the seat he had paid for. He had stayed. He had figured it out. He'd let the hum of the engines carry him west toward the city where tomorrow's meeting waited. Toward the contract that was currently suspended and would be reviewed and would eventually, in all probability, be signed. Not because nothing had happened, but because something had, and it was documented, and it now existed in the world beyond the walls of a first-class cabin. He let the morning and settle into something he could carry without it carrying him. Not a wound, not a triumph. A morning in which a man had sat in a seat and refused to leave and made the room reckon with who he was. And the room, slowly, imperfectly, with all its contradictions and its fear and its late-arriving decency, had done exactly that. He let himself have it. Just that, just the breath. Just the quiet, private, hard, one ordinary miracle of arriving at the other side of something difficult and still being exactly yourself. The horizon held its blue, the watch kept its time. And somewhere below the aircraft, the country continued its complicated, unfinished, essential work, as it always had, as it always would.